Right. Thanks, Nishant, for the introduction and for giving me this opportunity. In the next 15 minutes, we will. Is my voice clear to everybody? I can hear an echo.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Perfect. In the next 50 odd minutes, what we'll try to do is understand a little bit about the upstream petroleum contracts, the fiscal systems that exist, the type of contracts that are currently prevalent across the world, the major differences between them, and then we will go on to what a PAC is. For today's session, we'll stop at a very preliminary overview of the PSC. For tomorrow's session, we will go into a little deep in how PSC works. We will understand a little bit about the economics of it. We'll try to do a little financial modeling as well. Before the start of tomorrow's session, I will send across a dummy financial model that all of you can play around with as we go ahead and work on the PSCs. The reason why I want to kind of focus a little bit more on the PSCs is that by far they are the most popular contractual systems in the world. In terms of numbers, a lot of countries like India, which had adopted them, have now moved on to other systems like royalty tax regime, etc. But a PSC still remains a fiscally important tool. And in terms of financial modeling, that is perhaps a little bit more complicated by virtue of the way it is structured. Right? If that's okay with everybody, then I'd like to start off. I'll share my screen. Is this visible to everybody?
Yes, sir. It is visible.
Nice. So this is what I want to cover. Like I said, a little bit about upstream contracts, different type of contracts that exists, and then later dive a little bit into the PSC regime. What are the main components of a PSC regime? Primarily profit sharing and cost recovery. We'll try to do a little bit of understanding of what a legal and contractual matters are. I'll try to pick them up in today's session as well. And in tomorrow's session, we'll do financial modeling, valuation, and estimation. Uh, as I don't know how many of you have attended my previous sessions, whether with Advantage or otherwise. But at any point in time, whilst I am speaking, please feel free to speak up. You don't need to raise your hand. You don't need to wait till the end to ask me what if you have any doubts. If there's any relevant doubt to what I'm doing or speaking about or is present on the slide, please go right ahead and stop me if there's any doubt. Okay. All right. Now, the first, let's begin, and the a very sort of a philosophical and an existential question is, what is the need for a contract or fiscal system? Most countries have their own dedicated laws. They have their own regulations, some of which deal with contractual matters. But so why do we need a specific contract when it comes to oil and gas exploration? The reason for that is fairly obvious, that the oil and gas world is today commoditized. Each and every country is looking, or each and every country that has oil and gas, and this is not just about oil and gas, this is about natural resources in particular. They want to exploit those natural resources, whether they're hydrocarbon or whether they're carbon, to the fullest extent for the benefit of the host country. And that is why you need a robust framework of rules and regulations, yes, of laws and bylaws, yes, but also of fiscal, contractual, and economic conditions, which kind of specify how is it that that hydrocarbon or that natural resource is well found, exploited, and most importantly, how is it shared. So it is basically these sort of broad principles over which a contract or a fiscal system is designed. As we go ahead and we come to the last step, which is the for all practical purposes, I'm going to be using the word contractor for an oil and gas company. So the host government would be called a government or an national oil company, and the oil company which is exploiting or exploring and producing oil and gas. For practical purposes, I'll be referring to that as a contractor. The reason why we call them contractors and not oil and gas companies will perhaps be a little more clearer as we go ahead. So coming back to what I was saying, once the contractor or the oil and gas company has produced the oil and gas, and once it goes its share and it's received its share of the hydrocarbon or the natural resources, and then when it goes about in the open market selling them, there is this concept of or the issue of taxation that is very vexing. So you need these contracts and fiscal systems in place to keep into account all of those commercial matters under one particular law, right? So formulating and designing a petroleum contract is an art in itself, right? If you were to look at any contract of any two different countries, you will find that in certain cases there are vast differences in the way that contract handles a the exploitation and exploration of natural resources, and b the contractual terms associated with when that oil and gas or when that natural resource is found. Now, the aim of a petroleum contract is that it should balance the needs, and that is the main thing, that it should be fair to both the host government and the contractor, right? Now, this is in my view a slightly lofty assumption, because most countries are either pro the host government, or certain countries are pro the contractor. There are very few countries that walk the fine line, and the reason for that is fairly obvious. Countries which are rich in natural resources. So let's talk about E&P companies. The countries which have vast resources, which have vast reserves of both discovered and undiscovered oil and gas, they have contracts which are very stringent, which are very sort of I would say detrimental, but are not conducive towards the contractor, and they overtly favor the host government. The reason for that is obvious. Now, if Saudi Arabia says that I have a contract which is not very favorable, still oil and gas companies will go and rush if they were to sign a contract with Saudi Arabia, because there's just so much of oil and gas floating around. The same is the case with Iran. Same is the case with Kuwait, Iraq. All these countries, by virtue of having extensive resources, have fairly rigid and very sort of unbecoming and unwelcoming contractual regime. On the other hand, if you kind of flip that around, you have countries which do not have very well developed and extensive resources. I would say India is there. So because India is not a very prolific oil and gas geography, uh, it needs to attract both international and foreign players into its E&P game, into its E&P space, and that is why the Indian contracts are much more favorable towards the contractor. So there's sort of an L rule, right? I mean, if there is a country that has a lot of hydrocarbons, then its contractual terms will be fairly rigid. On the other hand, if there's a country that doesn't have too much of oil and gas reserves, if it's not a very prolific E&P regime, then it'll have much more favorable contractual regime. And that's where sort of the genesis or the philosophy of setting up a petroleum contract comes. Right? Now, the basics of the petroleum contract, as I said, are very, very sort of standard across countries, across fiscal systems. The first is that a petroleum contract establishes an authority by the government of the land in saying that here is this piece of land, whether onshore or offshore, that I'm giving to a contractor to exploit for oil and gas. Right? This allows the contractor access to that specific area. It is kind of bound by the longitudes and latitudes of that block or that field, and that provides it access to that particular area only. Now, that's very obvious. If you've been awarded a particular block, then you do not have rights and access for an adjacent or another block, and that's been defined as access to acreage clearly in the petroleum contract. The third most important sort of point in being established in a petroleum contract is, what do you do once you've had access to the acreage? Can you just drill? Can you just prospect and you cannot produce? Because there are certain contracts that are only exploration contracts. If you have to produce it from that oil and gas well or oil and gas field, then you need to change the contract. So what are the rights and the sort of rights, obligations, and the benefits that a contractor is provided by the host government by virtue of signing of that contract? So that's enclosed in a petroleum contract. And the most important is the fiscal terms. What is it that you can do with the oil and gas that you discover, export, and sell? Right? And that is defined in the fiscal terms. So that in for the purposes of this particular lecture or this particular session, that is the most important aspect that we're going to be looking at. How is it that the economics and the fiscals are clearly defined in a petroleum contract? Right? Any question till now? The genesis of petroleum contracts kind of goes back many years, hundreds of years back, when the concept of in the Indian system we had the zamindaris concept, or in Europe we had the landowner system, whereas the land was owned by one particular person who was not necessarily the farmer, but he would give out that land to laborers who would then farm on that particular piece of land. And in return, the landowner would get not just a sort of a fixed income, which was the rent, but he would also get a something called as an economic rent. Now, all petroleum contracts, especially the PSCs, hinge upon this particular concept of an economic rent. It is very different from what the rent is. Let's try to understand. So, if you were to juxtapose this picture about a particular farmland onto an oil and gas field, right? Here he's talking about factor 2, but to me this is factor 1. You have an acreage, right? That the host government wants to give out to a contractor for oil and gas exploration. The second is a contractor who is willing to take up that particular land and wants to prospect for oil and gas, right? In order to prospect for oil and gas, this laborer or this contractor would need access to capital. And this is the he's saying entrepreneurship, but to me this is the landowner, which is the host country, right? Now the economics of giving out a piece of land, which is your sovereign piece of land for a country, to an external party, whether it is whether international oil company or whether it is a private oil company, hinges upon the fact that the host country, as was the landowner many years ago, wanted to earn from that contractor a particular economic return. Now, this economic return, in most cases, one is fixed, right? Which is, let's say for example, 1,000 rupees per month that laborer has to pay to the owner for access to the land. The second is variable, right? Now, this variable component is where the economic rent comes in. So this is the rent for the land, and the variable part is the economic rent, wherein this landowner will get an increment based on whatever is the production that this laborer produces. The more the production, the more will be the economic rent. If there is no production, then the economic rent also comes out to be zero. And that is what the concept of a fiscal system, whether it is a production sharing contract or whether it is a royalty tax regime, that's where it comes in from, that the host government or the national oil company is providing a piece of land to the contractor, and in return, the contractor has to provide a fixed component in terms of rent and a variable component in terms of economic. So just to kind of put things in numbers.
Sir,
This.
excuse me, sir.
हाँ जी, बोलो.
Sir, is it necessary to pay variable economic rents to the landowner in terms of
That is
contract?
where the concept of economic rent comes in, because the landowner is saying that not only do I need a fixed income from you, but I also need a percentage of your profits, right? Because I have the land, and I'm giving, so for a national oil company, he's saying I'm giving you the acreage. So you have to give me a fixed income, which is the rent, and you have to give me a piece of the profit. So the variable income is actually a piece of the profit, which could be in the form of a royalty in terms of a royalty tax regime, or it could be the profit sharing when it comes to a PSC.
But sir, sometimes I like the land acquisition department goes to the landowner, like went to the landowner and they are like decided the price of the land, and they pay all the they pay all the monies at the one time, and
Fair
after
enough.
that
Fair
it
enough.
is
Fair enough. Then that means that that landowner is very risk averse. He does not want any upside.
okay,
Okay.
understood, sir.
Right.
Yeah.
To see exactly what you're saying, when we talk about the concessionary agreement, or when we talk about a risk service contract and an unrisk service contract, you'll see the difference, right?
Okay,
That the landowner does not want to take any risk and he just wants a flat fee.
okay.
All
Thank you,
right.
sir. Thank you, sir.
So this was the concept of an economic rent. Coming back to what you were saying. Let's say, for example, that the gross revenue, right? That whatever that piece of land, whether it was per year, whether it was dollars per year, or it was 100 kgs of fruits per year, was the revenue that that laborer was earning after working on that piece of land, right? Out of his total cost, his operating income or the total profits comes out to be around 600. Now, the royalty is what I was talking about. That is your variable pay, yeah, or your variable income, as you might try to call it. As the operating income goes, the owner's share of the variable income will also go up. It is 40% of whatever is the income. If it was 800, the income would be more, right? This comes out to what we call as the pre-tax income, right? Don't spend, we won't spend too much time on it because it's a little sort of uh, descriptive at this point of time. When we take individual cases, that is the time we'll kind of spend a little bit more time, right? So if you were to look at what are the total, so once you've paid the income tax on it, then the contractor share is left with the less costs, less royalties, and less income tax. So this is the contractor share or the laborer share. The owner's share, what is the owner's share? Owner first gets the royalty, and if the owner is part of the government, he also gets a part of the income tax. So that is where the split between a contractor and a government takes place. Now, this is more conceptual, right? So let's try to spend some more time. Yes. Right. Now, the entire concept of economic rent, as I had specified, if you were to put that down into what the oil and gas in the oil and gas industry, right? This is exactly what I was talking about. You have a specific set of costs that the contractor has to incur. Now, this could be either be risked, and we'll discuss that later, or it is unrisked, where he gets some sort of cost recovery, etc. out of it. But for all practical purposes, this is the cost that a contractor has to incur. On the basis of this money that he has spent, right, he gets a revenue, which is the total gross revenue that comes out. This is, in my previous slide, this was the $1,000 number. Now, out of this $1,000, this is the cost that the contractor has incurred for either for himself, or he has incurred for on behalf of the host government, which he can then recover, right? Now, this leaves us with the total profit. The total profit is a combination of the government take and the contractor take, right? Now, the concept of rent kind of comes about, that the rent is what the government is getting, firstly in the form of royalties, in the form of bonuses, which are usually fixed, right? And then you have something here which they haven't mentioned, that is, in certain companies also try to take a sort of a signature bonus, right? Which is a sign-on bonus, which is a fixed amount. So the government take depends upon your bonuses, and in certain cases, your production sharing and royalty, which is variable. All right. Is this kind of does that make sense? Is this clear to everybody?
Yeah, sir. Clear.
So the petroleum contracts, as you know, if you were to take it up from here and you were to take it to one step forward, the petroleum contracts can be broken up primarily into two parts: the concessionary agreements and the contractual agreements. As the word says, concessionary agreements are those sort of petroleum fiscal systems where the host government has provided a concession to a company for it to prospect for oil and gas. Right now, most of the concessionary agreements were actually historical, and I'll come to that in a little bit. Contractual agreements are what the current sort of arrangements reflect, and these are broken down primarily into two types: service contracts and PSCs. Service contract further is broken down into a pure service contract and a risk service contract. This, we'll discuss the difference between a pure and a risk service contract, which would provide you a little bit more clarity on the question that Nishant has raised. Why is it that the owner wants to take a variable income, and why does he just not be content with a fixed income? Because in a risk service contract, he also wants to take in certain amount of risk from the contract, right? So broadly speaking, in a concessionary system, the title of the hydrocarbon passes to the investor the moment that hydrocarbon comes out of the wellhead, right? The moment the oil comes out from the ground, that oil then belongs to the contractor. The royalties, etc., are then paid by that contractor or that investor, as I was saying in this case, for the right to utilize that piece of land. Right. So the distinction here needs to be made that unlike a contractual system, whether it is a service contract or a PSC, the investor usually gets the right to the production once the oil or gas or the hydrocarbon has been delivered to the government at the collection point, whether it is an export jetty, whether it is a pipeline system, whether it is a crude storage system, whether it is a storage tank. The moment that hydrocarbon passes from the contractor's system to the host government or to the government, that is the time he gets access to whatever revenue is available. It could be in the form of payment in terms of dollars when it comes to service contract, or it could be access to the actual hydrocarbon in terms of barrels of oil or gas when it comes to a PSC. Whereas in a concessionary system, the moment the oil and gas comes out of the well, then that oil and gas is literally or practically speaking the property of the contractor. Now, the concessionary systems were actually, came into being in the early part of early part of the last century, when oil and gas prospectors, right, in the 1900s went to the Middle East and they signed these concessionary systems with the sheikhs, with the tribes, with the shahs and kings of the Middle East, right? So it was a very simple sort of an understanding. This land belongs to, let's say, for example, the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran says, I give you this particular piece of land, it is yours. The moment you produce some oil and gas, that oil and gas is also yours. From the oil and gas that you produce, you give me some royalties. Right? So it was a very simple and a very straightforward system, which was superbly biased towards the oil and gas explorers, right? Because at that point of time, the Middle East had no oil and gas exploration capabilities. They were reliant on these prospectors who would come searching for oil and gas. So this picture is, as you might know, the first oil well that was discovered, or first gusher that was discovered in Majid A. Suleiman by a gentleman called William Knox Darcy. I think I think this is William Knox Darcy in Iran in 1908. And he had signed on a concessionary agreement almost 6 years. He was prospecting for oil and gas for 6 years, but he could find it only on the last few weeks before he was asked to pack up and leave. Similar system existed pretty much across the Middle East. This is the Dammam 7 well, which was the first well to kind of start producing in Saudi Arabia in 1938. And all of these were concessionary agreements. Now, these concessionary agreements have kind of slightly evolved to agreements that today exist in parts of North America, which again rely on the same concept that the ground or the piece of land, it could be offshore as well, or that piece of sea is given by the government to a company, an oil and gas company. That oil and gas company searches for oil and gas, and the moment it comes out of a wellhead, that gas is literally the property of that oil company, right? So the modern concessionary system is slightly different from what I had shown you in the past, and that is where they try to strike an equilibrium between how the royalty tax regime now reflects the best interests of both the host countries and the contractors, right? So again, let's say for example, you've got 1,000 barrels of oil coming out a day, or yearly revenues of 1,000 million, whatever you make it call it. The host government then takes into account the royalties straight off, right? It is not concerned how much you spend in terms of cost, whether you are incurring costs or not. Its royalties come out straight from the top, and then whatever is left, that is the operating income. The costs then, which have all been incurred by the contractor, have to be deducted from the operating income, and then you get the net cash flow or the net income that is less of costs. The government then adds another petroleum tax. This is not to be confused with income tax. Petroleum tax is a totally separate issue. This is another revenue stream for the host government, right? Now, whatever is remaining from the petroleum tax is the net taxable income that the contractor then needs to pay income tax on it. And this is the contractor's free cash flow. All right. The host government has got three sources of income. The first is it incurs the revenue in terms of the royalties. It incurs revenues from the petroleum tax, and in most cases the income tax is also then taken in by the country, and the government share is an addition of all three, right? In certain cases or in certain geographies, the income tax is kept separately, and for the purposes of calculation of revenue for the host government or the government shares, only 1 and 2 is taken. But for all practical purposes, you pay income tax to the government, so it has to be all three. All right. So this is what a royalty tax regime looks like. You have royalty tax regimes that are prevalent primarily in North America. They started off in the US. They've since been modified, but the basic structure looks pretty much similar to what a royalty tax regime existed some 200 years back. Anything that comes out of the ground belongs to that contractor. So it's not just oil and gas. If you're given that piece of land, if oil comes out, great. If gas comes out, perfect. If diamonds come out, excellent. If you've got only rocks and silica, that's your fault. But pretty much every resource below the ground belongs to the landowner in terms of a concessionary agreement. Right? That's where a difference between a concessionary agreement and a PSC comes in. Right? Any questions till now?
So
No, sir.
as
Sorry, go on. Somebody had a query? Hello.
so, sir, it means a concessionary system is a like one of the oldest contractual system of oil and gas industry, right?
It is the oldest system.
Yeah.
It has gone through certain changes. The concessionary system has now kind of morphed into the royalty tax regime. But the original concessionary system existed that the government, state government, federal government gave a piece of land to a prospector and said, this is yours, do whatever the hell you want with it. We'll just take some royalties, we'll take some tax, and then at the top of it, whatever profit you make, we'll take some income tax. All right.
Yes, sir.
Now, the second sort of slightly more common contractual system that exists is service contract. Now, the service contract, as the name suggests, uh, is not very friendly towards an oil and gas company or a contractor. And herein, the host government or the NOC exerts a lot of influence. So, the service contract basically says that here is this piece of land. This land belongs to me. Once you drill for oil and gas, whatever oil and gas comes out, that also belongs to me. I will take that oil and gas from you the moment it comes out of the wellhead. I will go and sell that oil and gas, and I will give you a piece or a certain dollar value for every barrel of oil that you produce. It's a flat fee that I'm going to pay, right? So you have, and this is slightly similar to the performance enhancement contracts that India is currently looking at. But the service contract basically says that you have an oil well, out of which you have to produce 100, say 1,000 barrels of crude or barrels of oil a day. For every barrel that you produce, I will pay you, let's say example, $1.2 per barrel. You produce more barrels, you get more earnings. You produce less barrels, you get less earnings. But by under no means does that oil or gas belong to you. So what this does is, in the service contract, since you do not have access or you do not have control to oil and gas, you miss out on any upside that might exist due to price fluctuation. So if the price of oil goes up and you have access to 1,000 barrels of oil, you will still get, let's say, that $1.2 per barrel. So you'll still get $1,200 in a service contract. You will not get that additional delta that an oil company would have gotten. So in effect, you're not an oil company at all. You're just a pure service contract, right? Now, the service contracts are of two types. One is a pure service contract. That means that all the risk of prospecting for oil and gas rests with the contractor. If you do not find oil and gas, that's your future. But certain companies and certain countries have started introducing a concept of a risk service contract, saying that, well, you put in the money, you search for oil and gas, whatever oil and gas comes out, that still belongs to the government or the host country, but we will allow you some amount of cost recovery, or we will allow you to recover some of the costs that you have incurred while kind of prospecting for oil and gas. So that's a slight mix that service contracts have taken over and above or similar to what a PSC takes. Iran has started looking at certain of these contracts. Venezuela, they started doing it because they were hit very, very badly with with Iran as well, with the US-led sanctions. But largely, countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and especially Abu Dhabi, they have very, very strict non-risk service contracts. That means that the country does not take in any risk. All the risk rests with the contract. So this is how the difference works, right? Now, in both cases, you are producing 1,000. So for the purposes of the service contract, we are saying that the field produces 1,000 barrels of oil per day. The cost of producing this particular uh, cost of producing this oil, let's say, is about 800, right? Now, the operating income at $1.2 per barrel is 1,200. In both cases, this is 1,200, right? Now, in the first case, if you were to look at only the pure service contract, the net income for the contractor is 1,200. He has spent 800 in prospecting for oil and gas, so his net income comes to 400. He pays a 20% tax on it, and the contractor's share is $320 for producing 100 BOP per day, 100 barrels of oil per day, right? Now, he has incurred this cost of $800 or 800 barrels equivalent cost. If this field had not produced that oil, right, that loss would have been his. But on the flip side, even if the field is producing oil, he's not getting the benefit that of the sunk cost, right? Sorry, this has to be a risk service contract. My fault, please pardon me. Right? In a risk service contract, the host government says, well, you know what? You've spent this $800 barrels equivalent cost. We will allow you to recover some cost of it before we start kind of sharing the cost with you, or before we start sort of recovering and paying the service contract. So very few service contract will allow 100% recovery, right? Most of them will allow between 40 to 80%. I have taken the high end, and out of the 800 dollars, or let's say 800 barrels of dollar equivalent that the contractor has spent, he is allowed to recover 644, right? His net income still remains the same as here because he's paying $1.2 per barrel of oil produced, and this is his operating income, right? But what he does is that he is also allowed to recover that $640 that he has spent on somebody else's behalf. So this 400, if you were to take here, and this 640 makes it 1040. So that is his total net operating income that he has then incurred on behalf of for this particular contract. He pays on this total, he pays a 20% income tax, which is 208, and this is the contractor's share, right? So you see the difference for a same field, which has the same production, which has the same fiscal terms. If he's allowed to recover his cost, the contractor's share more than doubles. This is, to my mind, almost 3x, right? All because of a risk service contract where the host country is allowing this particular contract to recover a part of the share. All right. Sorry if it's a little messy. Any doubts or any questions on this?
Request to all the participants, please ask your doubts. In my opinion, sir, it is well explained. We understand.
Right. So if there's nothing, then kind of let's move on to what the service contract does. When people look at this particular valuation or this particular method, it looks very regressive. That why is it that people or host countries still utilize a service contract? It's not very friendly towards the contractor. The reason for that is a service contract is very, very simple, right? You do not have to worry about any complex sort of royalties. You do not have to worry about any deviated economics or financial modeling that we will see tomorrow in a PSC, because there is no concept of cost recovery, there is no concept of profit sharing. Straight in, it's like computer programming, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. You're producing X barrels per day, you get paid Y dollars per every X dollar of per every X barrel that you produce. It's very, very simple, right? The ownership is not ever in doubt. Whatever comes out from the ground belongs to the host government. It is a very, very, sort of simple, cost effective, and easy to utilize concept. The biggest, and that is why a lot of countries in the Middle East utilize this particular concessionary system, or you utilize this particular fiscal system, is that it is very easy to supervise any working of a service contract, right? There is no cost involved. There is no inflation of cost, right? Yes, you can, the risk service contract allows you certain amount of cost recovery, but for all practical purposes, even the cost is a basis of the actual production, right? So the supervisory and control mechanisms in a service contract are extensive, and that is why countries which have very prolific basins, which have vast reserves and resources of oil and gas, utilize this particular concept, right? Now, this slide is a little simple. You know, it kind of gives you an idea of what is the basic difference between a concessionary agreement, between a PSC, and between that of a service contract, right? The as and I'm not going to go through this. It's fairly self-explanatory. In a concessionary agreement, the sort of ownership of the right or ownership of the resource rests with the oil company, and that is what is the most sort of advantageous aspect of a concession agreement. Um, the in the PSC, only the profit which a company makes in and gets as form if a profit share, does that belong to the contractor. The actual ownership of the petroleum resources still rests with the host government. Only after profit sharing does the contractor or the oil company get a share of those profits. The service contract is the easiest. Everything belongs to the host government or the oil company, except for the risk, because the entire risk then sits with the oil company. If it does not find oil, it is kind of down in the dumps. The compensation now is sort of, that's where the distinction between the three comes in. In the concession system, you are the owner of the oil. Hence, you are not compensated by anybody. Nobody is giving you the compensation. That oil is yours to do whatever you want. You can sell it in the market, you can export it outside the country or wherever you want to export it, or you can throw it down the dump. You are the owner. Nobody is going to give you any sort of payment when it comes to concession. In the PSC, your income is a share of the profit with the government. Whether that share is in kind, you actually get actual barrels, or in countries like India, where the government buys those barrels off of you at a denominated, pre-nominated price, you get a dollar equivalent of that price. That is your sort of compensation. That is your income that is coming in the PSC. In a service contract, it is very simple. It is a flat fee, usually $1 per every barrel of oil that you produce. Straight, simple, no fuss, no issues. Right? So this is where we stand. This is the kind of breakup of how a concession agreement, how a PSC, and how a service contract works. I'm going to spend a little bit, say another 5-7 minutes, we have some time, on how a PSC works. We will not go into detail. The economic modeling, and the financial modeling for the PSC, we will reserve for tomorrow. Right? So this is how it works. In a concession agreement, as I'd said, you have the total production that comes in. There is a royalty that goes off the top, and then there is the cost. Whatever is remaining is the contractor's share. He's free to do whatever he wants. He can sell it. This is his to take home, or he can throw it down the house. Service agreement again works on the same basis. You've got your gross production, out of which you are topping off your cost. What comes out is a dollar equivalent. Like I said, this is paid to the contractor in a dollar per BOPD basis, or it could be BOPD, or it could be BOP barrels per year, whatever is the case. This is a dollar equivalent that the contractor gets, and whatever is remaining from the top is the government share. Here, there, if you will see, there is no government involved. Government is absent. It is the most hands-off sort of a process. The production sharing contract is slightly different and fairly complicated. Again, the same system. You have the gross production, and from the top you've got the royalty and the cost that comes out of it. Now, the PSE has got a very unique system where whatever costs that a contractor incurs, right, he's allowed to recover those costs from the share, from the profit that comes out, right? It may not be oblivious, it may not be very obvious to you at this point. Hopefully tomorrow, when we actually start working on a financial model, it'll be clearer. But this is actually the first part of the contractor's income. Once all the costs have been recovered in a particular PSC, then the sharing of the profit takes place with the contractor, which is split between the government. It could be X% and Y%, and this Y% is the second part of the contractor's income. So when it comes to a PSC, the contractor has got two sort of components. One is his profit share, and one is his cost recovery, that he has recovered for the cost that he has incurred on behalf of the the, the government for all practical purposes. Right? Uh, Again, bit of reading. Don't want to kind of waste too much time on it. The PSC, not too many people will know, is actually developed in Indonesia in the 60s, and the concept, like I said, or the underlying rationale was that Indonesia had resources. It was a prolific oil and gas basin. Indonesia, then called the Dutch East Indies or Java during the Second World War, was one of the most prolific hydrocarbon basins, if you know your oil and gas history well. But around the 60s, the oil and gas wells had started depleting, and the host government at the NOC at that point of time, Pertamina, wanted international participation in the form of IOCs and foreign companies to come and bid for oil. And hence they invented something called as a petroleum sharing contract, where they said was, you come, you prospect for oil and gas, you spend money in exploring, developing, and producing for oil and gas. Whatever hydrocarbons that you produce, you pay us a royalty, and whatever is remaining after you have recovered your cost, we will share this a portion of the hydrocarbon with you. Now you got to realize that this at that point of time in the 60s, the world was hungry for oil and gas, and it was the big majors, the BP at that time. I think it used to be called, had the name changed. Yeah, in 60s it used to be called the Anglo-American Oil Company. You had Exxon Mobil, you had Standard Oil, right? All these companies, Shell, were the companies in the West that had the wherewithal and the technology. Asian companies or the countries did not have them. And that is why a PSC was developed, which actually, and this part is a little important, which regulates the percentage of oil and gas production that each party receives. And herein they are trying to be a little sort of balanced in their approach, where the PSC allows not just the host country to make a profit and to have a share and access of the oil and gas hydrocarbon, actual physical access to hydrocarbon, but it also provides the international oil company or the contractor to actually get a share, right? So it's a win-win for both. The PSCs allow the host companies to kind of maintain control. They allow the host countries to get a share, but then the NOCs, in sort of a quid pro quo for the technology and the expertise that they bring in, they are getting actual physical access to hydrocarbons.
Excuse
Right?
me, sir.
Haji.
One question from Pradeep Kumar, sir. He's retired from ONGC as a chief general manager, having more than 35 years of experience. So
Right.
he wrote that in service contract, the government or owner pays fixed price per barrel to the contractor. However, with the rise in price of crude or gas, the cost of production goes up because of high demand or rated service goes up.
Correct.
Then he wrote that in India, the government is applying GST on royalty paid to the state, which is bone of contact. So, what is your opinion on GST or royalty, which itself is a form of tax?
That is kind of nitpicking. The first part of Mr. Kumar is absolutely valid. That the service contractor does not get the benefit of the rise in prices. The price may rise, and because of that, the capital expenditure and the operating expenses will go up. But the contractor still receives a fixed component of $1.2, $1.6 for every barrel produced, irrespective of whether the cost is going up or not. So that way, it is regressive. So Mr. Kumar is absolutely right. that the service contractor or the service contract that way is heavily loaded against the contractor because it does not give him that upside of high cost, of high prices, but it hits him or her when the price goes up because of the expenses. Now, the on specifically to your point about the GST, so that is a taxation issue, and one of the reasons I became an engineer was because I did not want to study, did not want to become a CA. So my knowledge about taxation is very, very limited. But to me, if a service is being provided and that falls under the purview of the GST, it's not just in India, right? A lot of countries, the service contractor is hit twice. Once he's hit when he has to pay the service fee, and because he's providing a service and getting a fees, he also has to pay a GST. That is that is unfortunately how it is. I don't know if there's a if you're asking for my opinion whether it is right or wrong. It is just what it is, right? These are the contractual and the fiscal terms of each country, and they need to be. That's where a lot of you are sitting for this session, because we have to understand how financial modeling works. We have to understand what are the costs involved, not just at the input side, which is your capital expenditure, but operating expenses, but also your taxation issues, which actually give you your valuation of your plot, which is your sort of your net present value. We'll study the concept of an NPV and the free cash flow in tomorrow's session. Does that kind of answer his query?
Yeah. Thank you, Kapoor sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Again, kind of going back to a PSC, the most important concept and also perhaps slightly confusing, and which is the bone of contention. That is why a lot of countries are doing away with PSC, is the concept of cost recovery. That contractors tend to inflate the costs that they have spent. There have been cases, at least in India, where contractors have bought jets and they've done up their houses, and they've done up their not just their residences and their offices, but and try to include those costs as field costs. So that's where the concept of cost recovery comes in. There's a concept called ring fencing, which we'll study, etc., which tries to limit the costs that are incurred in that particular block or field as operational expenses. Right. So these are the main points of a PSC, wherein the contractor is allowed to recover his cost, and that is when the division of the profit oil sort of takes place. Right. I think Shant, we've sort of overshot by a couple of minutes, so this would be a right time to talk. What I wanted to discuss and what I wanted to share with all of you was what are different types of contracts. How is it that they are developed? What is the distinction between a field owner and an operator, a host company and a contractor? And hopefully tomorrow we'll delve into the financial and the economic aspects. Right. I will be happy to share these slides at the end of the session. You don't need to take screenshots, or you don't need to try to write down or record it. At the end of the session, I'll send a PDF or I'll send a PDF to Nishant, and then he can then share it with everyone.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Right.
Thank you, sir.
Any questions, or should we close for the today's session?
Why is Iran following this risk service contract, sir? Like having so much oil and gas and so much prolific oil and gas reservoirs?
Precisely the reason because it's got so much of oil and gas. Precisely the reason because it's got so much of oil and gas. Can it, afford to go in for a contractual regime which is so skewed towards the host country? Right?
Yeah.
I've had the pleasure and the honor of working in Iran for a long period of time, and the attitude of the NIOC, National Iranian Oil Company, is like, we have the oil and gas. If you put a drill bit down, you will find oil and gas. Right? This is a service contract which puts all the onus and all the risk on you. you will get very limited upside. But the positive side of it is that the GCF, the geological chance factor, of finding oil and gas in Iran is so high that anybody will work on it, even if the risks is loaded against it.
Yeah, sir, but it's a risk service contract, right? I mean to
Yeah,
say,
okay,
the company can recover the cost.
Yes. So that is happening because over the last few years, when the West imposed sanctions came into Iran, the Western companies were not willing to kind of operate there, or international oil companies were not willing. So they decided to sweeten the deal a little and try to bring in a concept of a risk service contract.
So that's like a temporary phenomena, probably.
That's like a temporary phenomenon. In fact, at one point of time, Iran was also talking about going into a PSC regime. They had floated in 2014. They had floated a draft PSC. They used to call it PSA, Petroleum Service Agreement. That was just born out of sort of desperation that their oil and gas industry was suffering at that point.
Okay, fine, sir. And what about India, sir? So India follows this production service contract?
It did till a few years back, and that is where the problem of cost recovery started coming in. People started building the most expensive houses in the world and try to recover that cost from PSCs. That is why the government decided that they moved on to what we now have called as a royalty tax regime. So the NELP rounds, NELP 1 to 9, new exploration licensing policy, was based on the PSC regime, but the new fiscal bidding rounds that are coming up, whether it is the OALP, or Open Acreage Licensing Policy, or the HELP before that, Hydrocarbon Exploration Licensing Policy, or the DSF, the Discovered Small Field Rounds, are all on the are all on the royalty tax regime.
Fine. Thank you.
Right. If there's nothing else, shall we close for the day?
Okay, sir. Thank you so much for this session. And tomorrow we will begin with the 7 p.m. onwards. So please, I'm requesting to everyone, please attend the sessions. And yes, we will definitely provide the recorded sessions once we are uploading on the YouTube channel. Thank you, sir. Thanks for your.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank you.
good